right through and well into the 20th century, printing unions were very concerned that the secrets of what they did, which they referred to as the mysteries, would never get out into the general public. Many headed were not to know how to do anything to do with printing at all. And I found it interesting that among the things that nobody was supposed to know about were, of course, hand-setting type, printing on any kind of a press, making paper, binding books, or casting, designing, cutting, casting type. Well, to me, these people who sometimes still insist on keeping everything to themselves and not telling anyone how they do things or how it's done or why it's done are rather contemptible, because the book, after all, is at the root of everything we have studied. Our whole education, our whole culture is ultimately based at some level on the book, on printing. And one of the parts which still remains a mystery to me in every sense of the word is this, the typecasting and designing of type that Jason does. Now Jason, I mean, he said all kinds of nice things about me, and I could quite easily say as many nice things about him. I am in awe of Jason's abilities when it comes to not only to printing, but to what he does to create type. Now I know in principle how it's done, and Jason will explain it in detail, but to me, the craftsmanship involved, the use of the hand, the way in which very, very careful details must be worked out with what seem to be quite impermeable materials, brass and steel and lead type metal and all the rest of it. To me, it seems inconceivable that anyone could do the beautiful things that Jason does through that process. So I'm going to sit here with my mouth wide open listening to all this stuff that I don't really understand, but I believe every word that Jason says, because he's the kind of person that always tells it to straight. So please join me in welcoming Jason Dewinetz.
What I had planned this evening is a bit of a mishmash, because that's what doing this stuff is. It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But I wanted to start out with the fact that everything that I've learned how to do that I'm going to talk about tonight is a direct result of Jim Rimmer. So I see some familiar faces here tonight, and I know that you know who Jim Rimmer is. But if you don't, Jim Rimmer was a printer, illustrator, typecaster, type designer, very influential, if little known, hero of typography in Canada. And I first encountered him, how did I first encounter him? I don't think it was really that far before the Rimmer Fest, which was an event that I think SFU put that together.
Well,
right. So it was a night to honor Jim's contribution to typography in Canada, and it happened quite timely because it wasn't that long after that we lost Jim. But at that event, I was introduced to all the things that Jim did, and what piqued my interest was the fact that he actually made type. I didn't know anyone who still did it. And I think that most people today don't know that people who still do that. What I eventually learned about Jim is that he was the definition of a man of all trades. He seemed to know how to do everything. And I eventually, sort of the same way that I did with Jen and Crispin, latched myself onto him, and I would go down to New Westminster where he lived and visit him from time to time. And in his basement, he had this crazy medieval workshop where he still made type. And I got really interested in the process, and so I would go down once or twice a year to visit him and learn a little bit from him each time I went down. Unfortunately, very soon, Jim got sick. He was in the process of trying to help me find a casting machine so that I could start making my own type. We didn't have much luck trying to find one. We found one way down in the States, and it was just going to cost too much to get it out here. Anyway, just when I was really kind of getting to know Jim and bonding with him, he got sick, and he was gone very quickly. I offered to help his wife, Alberta, deal with his stuff. So I offered to go in and inventory everything in the shop for her and put together a document that she could use to figure out what she wanted to do with it all. And I did that mainly because I was desperately curious to spend some time in his shop and see what was there and explore it. It took me 3 days, and here's the first, I'm sorry for Ward. This window is going to become important. This was a window looking into Jim's workshop. And this is the kind of state of the workshop when I walked in. So this is one counter space in quite a large workspace, and it all looked like that. It was just, forgive my French, shit everywhere. Most of which I didn't know what it was. So it was first a process of sort of creating piles all over the place, and then pulling out manuals and trying to figure out what does this belong to and where does this go. If anything I've learned is don't allow my shop to become like this, because if I get hit by a bus, someone else will have to go through that process. Anyway, it was also, one of the things I've learned in this process is you have to take everything apart to learn it. So in a way, it was probably good because it forced me to find out what all these bits and pieces were. Eventually, I got that document put together and I sat down with Alberta and I said, Alberta, okay, here's the inventory. I would really like to buy all this stuff now that I have this inventory. And so we went through it kind of item by item. She had been feeding me for the last 3 days so I could get this done. I was covered in mouse poop, dust. It was disgusting. And I pitched a price to her, and she, being the wonderful person she is, said that's way too much money, and I think this is a better number, and we came to an agreement. It was wonderful. Shortly after that, there was a memorial for Jim, and I was asked to speak at that memorial. And in prepping for tonight, I pulled out what I read at the memorial, and there was a piece of it that kind of stood out that I wanted to read right now. So this is part of what I read that night. In North America, there might be a small handful of people still cutting original type designs, and even that is likely an optimistic appraisal. Those who still engage in this stuff are a breed concerned only with the challenge and the small rewards of attempting a task for the sake of the attempt. As a process of discovery and experiment, wholly absorbed in the minutiae of the moment and the beauty of the act of creation. Jim would likely find that comment sentimental and flowery, but I'll let it stand. His contribution to typography, Canadian and otherwise, was immense, and his range and breadth a wonder to behold. I then announced to the audience at the memorial that Alberta and I had come to this agreement about his equipment and that I would be taking it all back to Vernon. And I concluded by saying it will be a massive undertaking to set up the equipment, learn how to use it, and muddle my way along until I'm able to produce something decent, but it's an honor and a privilege to take up that challenge. And I hope I'll be able to do Jim's legacy justice, but I'd like to think he'll be guiding my hand with a wink and a nod. That was 2010, 16 years ago. Last year, I cut my first type. So it's taken a while. And tonight I want to talk a bit about why it's taken that long. One other thing that I'll start with here, and this is from, what was this from? This was an article I wrote, I think for the Dillon's Artisan. They had a special issue on Jim Vernon. They asked a bunch of us to write short memorial pieces for him. And in that one I wrote, my intention for Jim's gear is to carry on the traditions he worked within for the past half century, being to design, cut, and cast proprietary types for the use of Greenboathouse Press, just as Jim did for his pie tree press. This will be a fairly long-term plan. This was 60 minutes, as I'll first need to move, build a new shop, set up that shop, and of course learn how to operate the new gear. This summer I'll be attending the ATF conference in Ohio, so that was 2010. I've been to 5 of those conferences since then. In Ohio, where I look forward to workshops with Rich Hopkins and Greg Walters, both of whom are typecasters in the States. And from there, I'll have a lot of reading to do before attending what will likely be a few years of muddling along before I'm able to produce anything worthy to print. But all of this, despite the challenge it poses, is a source of the same excitement and inspiration I felt in those first visits to Jim's shop. I feel honored to be in this position and look forward to years of making time. I have to say that when I made this arrangement with Alberta and moved all of Jim's typecasting gear back to Vernon, I was terrified. I was terrified because I was afraid I was going to let down Jim's legacy. And the truth is, probably no one would know if I let down that legacy because I would have just disappeared into the ether and people would wonder whatever happened to Jim's gear. But I felt it. And for the first few years that I had that stuff, it was all sitting in the storage compartment while I tried to find a place to live where I could set everything up. So I already felt like I was behind schedule. Eventually I did find a house where I set up some of the equipment and kind of learned how to operate it, and I learned that by literally taking the monotype typecaster apart bolt by bolt and putting it back together again, until I gained an understanding of the basic mechanics of the machine. It's an amazing machine, which I'll get into a little bit more when I show you some of the things that it produces. And And then eventually I moved again, actually built a house and a shop where I could set everything. Along the way I was going to these ATF conferences, usually all over the States. They sort of move around every 2 years. And at each of those conferences, there's a 3-day workshop where someone shows you how to use a specific piece of equipment. So I went to those religiously and was supposed to go to the one this year in Portland until Maniac took over, and so I won't be going to that one. But at each of those conferences, I learned a little bit more, and I would go home and apply that new knowledge to the machines that I had set up. So a couple more pictures here of Jim's shop. So one of the things I'm going to show you is a brief clip from a documentary on Jim on how he produced type and how I'm doing it slightly different. What Jim would do, based on the work of a guy named Frederick Gowdy down in the States, is Jim would start by actually drawing his letter forms, and then he would cut them out with Bristol board, thick paper. He would just literally cut those patterns out of paper. The first step in his process was then to use a pantograph machine. In case you're not familiar with the pantograph, you'll see it in the video that I'm going to show in a minute, but essentially it's a tracing tool where on this end there's a tracing stylus, and on this end there's a spinning, engraving, and cutting tool. And as you move this one over here, this one moves in tandem. And so what he would do with that paper pattern is trace that with the follower, and that would cut the same letter at a reduced size into type metal, which you can see some of these type metal patterns right here. What I'm doing is using acrylic, and essentially this is the equivalent of Jim's lead pattern here. So rather than go from a paper pattern to lead, I'm going straight from the computer with a laser cutter and cutting it into the acrylic. In a way it's cheating, because the pantograph involves much more handwork. Right? So if your hand is shaking, that's going to show up. And so I believe that was very important to Jim, the fact that he was drawing everything by hand, tracing it by hand, so that those flaws would find their way into the type. And those flaws, of course, are what make the type unique, distinctive, and interesting. But I'm not the artist that Jim was, so I'm cheating and going straight to it. This is another picture from Jim's workshop where you can see some of the tools of the pantograph machine and what it is like patterns. What I want to get to is this was me trying to move all of Jim's gear. So this is me looking in that window that I showed you at the beginning. This is after hoisting some of the machines up and getting them onto pallets. So these are 2,000, 2,500 pounds a piece. This is me by myself with a crowbar. And I don't know if you can really get the sense of what this is like. That window ledge is about 2.5 feet off the ground. And what I had to do is jack everything up onto wooden blocks and get the machines 2.5 feet off the ground and then try to get them out that window. I think there's one more where you get a bit more of a sense of scale. There, see how high that's stacked up? That's 2,500 pounds doing this on a bunch of wooden blocks. Somehow I got them all out the window and onto a moving bed and I moved them up to burn. The only thing that went wrong was I dropped a 200-pound iron crucible on my foot. Not pleasant. Didn't do any damage to the crucible. This picture always makes me kind of sad. This was Jim's workshop after I got everything out. And just as I was reinstalling all the back. So that's just a few pictures of getting everything out of Jim's. I mentioned some of the events that I've gone to over the years, and I just wanted to show a few quick pictures of that. In 2011, when did we go over? No, that's okay. In 2011, I planned this crazy research trip to go to Holland and research Jan van Krippen, Dutch type design. And along the way, I stopped in New York. So in New York was Theo Rehak and the Dale Guild. Theo Rehak was the last sort of employee from the American Type Founders. When that company went out of business, he bought as much of their equipment as he could so he could continue casting type. This was in Howell, New Jersey. When Theo retired, he passed the equipment on to a guy named Micah Courier, who set up as the Dale Guild, and Micah was still making type. Micah was the last person that was still designing, engraving new matrices on a Benton engraver. There's 3 of them left in the world, and Micah had one of them. So I went to New Jersey to learn what I could from Micah. And there's a few quick pictures here. That's just one of the casting machines. You can see fresh type coming out of it. That's the Benton engraver that I just mentioned. This is a pivotal caster. So in the old days, by old days I mean 500 years ago, when they cast type, they were doing it one piece at a time in hand. So you would pour some liquid metal into a hand mold, you get one piece The next step up from that is what was called a pivotal caster, and it was essentially still a one piece at a time operation, but you turned a crank to put the lead in instead of pouring it in by hand. So this is a pivotal caster, and Micah was letting me run it by cranking it and spinning some type up. That's Theo, Micah, and I, so that was in New Jersey. This was 2012. Then I hopped across the pond, and this is in Antwerp at the Planten Moretus Museum, one of the oldest printing museums in the world. So I stopped by there. Here's some steel punches, and I'm going to talk in a minute about the role that punches play in making type. This is Patrick Goossens. Patrick is a winger. I stayed with him in Antwerp. His family has run a bakery in Antwerp for 250 years. And they have this building in Antwerp. The bakery's on the bottom floor, and the top 3 floors were a residence. And it seems to have become the sort of hoarding dump of his family for 300 years. It was just full of the weirdest stuff, and I stayed there by myself. Well, it was very strange. Anyway, Patrick collects iron hand presses. And the last time I heard from him, he's up to about 350 of them. So this was one of his warehouses, one of multiple warehouses full of iron hand presses. So you can see the two of us standing there, these rows go back. There was just dozens and dozens and dozens of them. Now, I have mixed feelings about this, of course, because he's hoarding them, but the truth is 90% of them would have been in the scrapyard if he didn't take them. He does sell them. He actually tries to find people who want to use them. Use them being the operative phrase, not in museums. So he does try to get them back out in the world, but the important thing is that he's saving. Most of the folks in the States don't like him because he comes over to the conferences and buys everything at the auctions. Okay, then I ended up in Holland. This is in Haarlem, where the Enschede print works, where Jan van Crippen worked his whole life. I just thought it was funny that this is Jan van Crippen Way, and it's right next to the IKEA. These are some pictures of punches that, types that Van Crippen designed. They were cut by a man named P.H. Radish. He did all the punch cutting for Enschede. This is sort of 1900 to 1930-ish. And as you can see, he was busy, cut a lot of punches. This is Greg Walters. So I mentioned in that bit that I read at Jim's memorial that I was going to a conference in Ohio to see Greg Walters. Greg has a warehouse. I think he had 500,000 pounds of equipment in it. He too is one of these guys who just kind of buys up whatever comes available so that it doesn't get scrapped. Greg died a couple years ago and willed his collection and his building, and in fact his entire estate, to become a museum, but a working museum. So there's some people down there, they call themselves the print stewards. And they formed a charitable organization, and they're using all of Greg's funds to create this working museum where people can actually go there and learn how to cast type and cast type. So they're in the process of getting all that set up. You should look them up on Instagram. They're great. They have a Patreon. They can always use some links. So this was Greg's warehouse. This was in how do you say where Mike and Wendy are from?
Scandinavians.
Yeah, from there.
Upstate New York.
Yeah, it was another one of the conferences. I actually learned my dad in this one, which was great. And this one was wonderful because the workshop was on a supercaster, which is the machine that I got from Jim. And so I actually got to sort of serve as instructor at this one because I knew more about that particular machine. Usually at these conferences, it's a bunch of 80-year-old guys and then a few of us that were in our 40s at that time. So it was great to show them a few guys. This is a trip that Caitlin and I took to England where we went to the Monotype Works, which used to be the remnants of the Monotype Corporation. And it was called the Type Archive. It unfortunately recently has also shut down. In fact, every single thing I'm showing you tonight doesn't exist anymore. The Haarlem, the Enschede Archive is now no longer. The Type Archive has been shut down and everything's in storage. Greg died, but his is becoming a working museum. This is getting depressing. So Caitlin and I did the tour here. This guy's name is Kumar. I can't remember what his last name was, but he had been working there for 40 years or something, and he was the only person left that knew how to operate all of the equipment in the workshop. And in fact, until the day they locked the door, he was still there making type. So he gave Caitlin and I a great tour. She's taking the pictures, which is why she's talking about. And this is Kumar showing me around some of those machines. All right. I really tried hard to learn how to do this stuff so that I can continue doing what Jim did, right? This is the sort of motivation that had me flying over for the world to go to all this stuff. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit of process. I've shown a few pictures, punches, what's a punch? Okay, so 500 years ago, what you do is you take a steel rod and you carve a letter on the end of it. Okay, so what we're seeing over here is the punch. You then take that steel punch and you pound it into a block of copper, which ends up making what's called a strike, but eventually turns into what's called a matrix. So this is the matrix here. That matrix is put onto an opening in the mold in a casting machine, and the cavity of that mold is filled with molten type metal. And when you lift the matrix off, what you see is the face of the piece of type, and that's what we all use to print our books with. The next picture is a little more detailed. So here you're seeing the punch with it being held up above the block of brass. When it's pounded into the brass deforms, obviously, right, because you're hitting it quite hard. So then what you're doing is you shave off the sides and mill the top of it smooth, and making sure that the depth that you punched it in there is just the right depth that you need to make a piece of type. And eventually you end up with the finished matrix here, and of course the finished piece of type. So that's the process that happened when Gutenberg was making type. Eventually what many of the typecasting companies in the 1800s and 1900s learned is that it was much quicker to engrave your matrix rather than cut a steel punch and pound it in. So that's where the pantograph came into play, where you were now engraving that letter into, and they switched materials because copper is notoriously hard to engrave, to switching to brass. So these are just a few more pictures of some steel punches, and here you can see one partially finished and one that's completely finished. Jim actually did cut some punches, but he cut it in type metal, so he would actually take a piece of type and actually carve a new letter on the end of it. He would use what are called quads, which means there is no letter on it, and he would actually carve it in there. And then you grow a mat, well, I'm just all over the place, by a process called electrodeposition, where you put it into an acid bath, and let's not do that. Here's someone actually carving a punch. I found these images online. This is Nettie Gable, who I understand is one of the last people who's still actually cutting steel punches, along with Stan Nelson down in the States. So I just grabbed a few of these great pictures. This is a punch press, so you can see the punch is right here, and it's being forced down into that copper bar. So rather than pounding with a hammer like they used to, this is much more controlled, and you're slowly pressing it into the brass. And over here is what's called the strike, and you can see how the copper's been deformed by the pressure pushing the punch into.
Sorry, what do you cut the steel with?
Gravers, so literally little engraving tools. If we go back to that picture right here, so you can see it's a steel tool with a very sharp end on it.
So really hardened steel.
Yeah, so the steel punch originally is quite soft, and then I don't know a lot about this process, but after you've cut it, then you anneal it to harden it.
Okay.
And that's when you're punching it into the copper.
Got it.
So I've seen Stan do a demo of punch cutting, and the steel they start out with, he literally, you can see he's just scooping the metal out of it. So obviously the tool is hardened steel, but you're working with soft steel to begin with, and then you are. I don't do any of this stuff. I can't understand how anyone could do this stuff, but quite often I have people say they don't understand why I can do this stuff, so it's all metal. Okay, what next? I think the next thing to do is to show you a short video that I put together of me doing what I'm gonna show you samples of in just a minute, because it walks through a bit more in detail the various stages in this process. Unfortunately, we're stuck with this little screen, so I'll make this as long as I can, and again, the sound probably isn't going to try to be better. I think I'll just turn off the sound actually. What I start by saying is that I'm using the same methods that Jim is using. In just a minute, it's going to show you those steps in typeface, so that's what I'll narrate. I have some samples of the actual type up here that you can look at after. The first step in the process is to prepare the matrix blank. It starts out with this hunk of brass right here. This is just bar stock. So what I've got it on here is just a bandsaw, and I'm cutting it into roughly the size pieces that I'm gonna need to make the matrices. Jim used a different material, because Jim largely made what were called flat mills, and this is what monotype produced. So you can see that this is a much smaller piece and it's very thin, and I found it almost impossible to produce these in multiples and keep spec, because the piece of metal was just too small. Whereas this larger brass is just easier to work with, and it also just allowed me more margin for error because it was thicker, and if I made a mistake, I could keep engraving deeper until I got it right. This is just a milling machine where I'm taking the pieces that I cut and cutting them to get a little bit more accurate at each step. Eventually, each piece of brass that I use to make a matrix has to be exactly the same, within a half a thousandth of an inch. They have to be the same thickness every time, because if they're that much off, then your resulting piece of type is going to be that much off. So it's an enormous amount of work just to produce the blank pieces that I'm going to start working with. I think I put about 40 hours of work into making these matrix blanks before I even started engraving. So this is just finishing up the milling. Then it goes on to ATF fitting machine, which is another kind of end mill where you clamp the piece in, and now what I'm doing is taking this, and you can see this here in just a second. There's the piece right there, and here's the spinning milling blade, and that's moving it past the blade this way, and so what I'm getting is a perfectly true and smooth surface here, and then you turn it this way and do all four sides so that they're perfectly square. And this is where it gets really important, because if any of those measurements are off, when you put it into the pantograph, you're going to be engraving to a different depth every time. So painstaking stuff, and this is part of what fascinated me about what Jim did, is that it required so much precision to get it even to this state where it was okay, right, let alone good. So this is after all of the milling. This is going on 1,000 grit sand, wet dry sandpaper, to get the smoothest surface that I possibly can on the map. And then I'm measuring, you can see there, this is called a slip gauge. And that, again, is just getting them all to the exact same thing. So this is, you can see all of them are ready. Okay, so cutting tools were the biggest nightmare. I'm gonna pause here for a second. When you're using an engraving machine, you end up with a 1/8" steel rod that you sharpen to a point, and that's what's actually doing the engraving. The way a pantograph works is if your pattern, let's say, is 10 times bigger than the size of the piece of type that you want to engrave, that's easy enough to set on the machine to a 10-to-1 reduction. What's important is that the following tool, let's say that's my finger, then has to be exactly 10 times bigger than the tip of the cutting tool. Because if those proportions are off, then your whole scale reduction is off. That's relatively easy. What's hard is the fact that when you're engraving your type,
Go big way.
imagine a letter at 10 point, and you've got a little serif at the top of your letter, and you need to get the corner of that serif engraved. So the tip of your cutting tool has to be unbelievably small. In fact, my final cutting tool is 2/1000 of an inch. It's very, very small. Now, as you would imagine, when you're putting that into a piece of brass and engraving, it's going to break, right? If you put too much pressure, if you go too deep. And so what you have to do is prepare about 20 of those cutting tools, knowing that they're going to break during the process. The hardest step in this process, Crispin was saying, Crispin knows more about printing than I'll ever know, but he looks at making type the way that I look at how does he do what he does, right? All of it's a piece of cake, except for these cutting tools, right? Because you have to make 20 of them that are exactly 2/1000 of an inch at the tip. And I had no mechanical way of reproducing that reliably. Jim Rimmer's method was, he would put the cutting tool into a grinder and get it to a perfect 0. That's easy, you can get it to an absolute. Then he would take that tool and drag it on a stone, and he would just guess, that much. And then he would put it under a microscope. I tried that for 2 years. And if you go half a centimeter too far, you've gone from 2,000 to 10,000. Now you've got to regrind it back down to 0 and try it again, try it again, try it again. This was my biggest hurdle in all of this process. And what I eventually came up with is somewhat ridiculous. So that's the grinding machine that's going to grind to a 0 point. So you've got a 4-sided cutter that goes to an absolute point. You can't engrave with an absolute point. It will just I came up with. Move on.
Is everything moving?
But it's
No,
big.
it's a still photo. It's supposed to be. Right here. Okay, so this is the microscope that I got from Micah. This came from ATF. That has graduated scale in the eyepiece in thousandths of an inch. So when you look at your cutting tool underneath it, you can see exactly how big your tip is. Here's some cutting tools. All right, so this is what I came up with. I took a block of brass and drilled a hole through it, and then I put the engraving tool in there with a set screw down the middle so I can lock it into position. Now, because it's a four-sided cutter and a four-sided block, I could then rotate it 90 degrees each time. So that's how I sort of held it secure. Then what I did is I put it on what's called a glider saw. So printers use glider saws for trimming a variety of different pieces of furniture and things we use in the print shop. And it's essentially a table saw, except the table moves rather than the piece that you're, with a table saw you run your piece of wood through. Here it's the table that moves back. So what I did is, here's my little block with the cutting tool, and this is a diamond stone. And I actually mounted the stone in the movable part of the table. And as you'll see here, I then put the cutting tool at a 45-degree angle and slowly moved the stone against it. And what I eventually did is came up with a system where moving the table exactly this amount would get me the same result on the tool every time that I did it. It took a lot of trial and error. But I got to the point where within a day I could crank out about 10 cutting tools that would be exactly the spec. So it took me a few days to sort of get enough cutting tools together that I could really confidently start cutting and know that I had enough cutting. That's the finished cutting tip. So that right there, that's actually a 10 thou wide cutter. So the first cut you do in the matrix, you're just removing a lot of metal, so you use a fairly big one. This was another problem that I discovered with Jim's equipment. This is the pantograph. So the cutting tool is sticking out right there. Jim's method of putting the cutting tool in and out, the collet on the machine, the collet's what tightens up to hold that engraving tool, was sticky. And so Jim's way of getting the tool out was to slam it with a wrench. And unfortunately, this wasn't good for the machine. So what eventually happened is the machine now has what's called runout. And what that means is if this is the cutting tool sticking out of the collet, Jim hit it so many times that instead of spinning true, it did this. So now it was on a slight axis. If I'm trying to cut a line that's 2/1000 of an inch wide, and I need it to go straight, and I'm using a 2000 point, but instead of spinning, it's doing this, now it's cutting a 6 thou wide line, right? Because it's not spinning on its true axis. So that was a real hurdle with this machine, is that I had no way to get it. So essentially, I had to design the type so that I would never have to get smaller than what I was capable of with the machine. So these are the lessons that I learned from Jim, because he was constantly having to work against these kinds of impediments. But gotta keep going. So you can see here how much run out there is there, that you shouldn't see any movement on this dial gauge. So that's the tool doing this instead of spinning. Okay, patterns. So I've already talked a little bit about the fact that I was cutting using a laser cutter. The type I'm supposed to be talking about tonight, but haven't yet, is called Orfei, and it's based on a 16th century calligrapher that I discovered in history of lettering textbooks. And I was just fascinated by these Roman capitals, and didn't know any types that captured their spirit as much as I wanted, so I decided I was going to do it. I've already showed you this picture, and this is just talking a little bit about Jim's process of starting with a paper pattern, going through a lead pattern, and eventually that lead pattern is used to trace that into the matrix. But instead, this is me drawing the letters in Adobe Illustrator, so this is where I started. This is going to my laser cutter. These are the patterns for the laser cutter. And I'm just going to pause there just for a second. You can see there's two versions of each letter, so here's the H. The first cut you do in your matrix is what's called the counter cut. And that's because when you get to these very thin serifs and very thin strokes, if you cast a piece of type like that, these will just break off all the time. And so what you do essentially, I'm going to show you on a whiteboard. If you have a curve like this, your first engraving, you all of this area is gonna be engraved. And then eventually, as you go deeper and deeper into the matrix, that's where you start cutting just the serif. So the first pattern is to cut the sort of larger shape into the matrix that's gonna support the actual face of the letter. And then as you go deeper into the matrix, you actually cut the shape of the letter that will actually print when you make a piece of type. So that's what it's talking about here, and in just a second, you'll see a little bit of footage of the actual way they cut the pattern. I don't know if any of you have laser cutters, they really stink when you're cutting acrylic. All right, so there's the finished cube. There's some of the finished patterns. These will be up here. You can come out. All right, so now we're just gonna see some footage of the actual typograph. So you can see the pattern up here, and the cutting tool is right at the end of that. These are the different sizes of followers. So here I'm cutting a capital letter S, and that's the counter cut. Right? That's that first cut where you're just clearing up the space. And that's after the first cut. I'm saying first, there's actually 5 levels of cuts that you do, but each time you go deeper, you use a smaller and smaller engraving tool. And here's cutting the actual face of the letter. And there's that finished matrix. Now, this is another thing that I feel compelled to talk about. Imagine a letter this big. Okay, here's the pattern. Now, imagine you had to trace, or let's say you had to fill this in. Okay? You draw the outline on a white piece of paper, and you have the outline. And now you have a white pencil crayon, sharpened as sharp as you can get it. And you need to fill in the entire letter, white pencil crayon on white paper. So you cannot see where you've gone and where you have. That's what it's like engraving this pattern, because while I can see where I'm moving the follower, I can't see where the cutting tip is in the matrix. So I don't know if I've covered that little fraction of an inch. So essentially what you have to do is go over it 3 or 4 times with the smallest little movements you can imagine, and just hope that you're getting every single part of that pattern. Right? Because if you don't, it's gonna leave a tiny little brass sticking up in the matrix, and then when you cast that piece of type, it's gonna have a little hole in the face of the letter. So what I ended up having to do when I was engraving is, you can see the first movement here, I'm sort of, so the first is just kind of a scratching motion. So I do the entire letter, hoping that I'm getting every single part of the pattern. The second time, I can do the outline of the letter to make sure I'm getting a nice smooth line around the shape. And then the third one is doing little tiny circles. Now what I discovered later was that I actually had to do it one more time, doing circles in the opposite direction. Because the spinning engraving tool is going fast enough that it gets hot, and you're working with brass, which is fairly malleable metal. And so what happens is you get these little swirl patterns. So it's not actually cutting so much as it's kind of burnishing. And if you only do it in one direction, you get very noticeable swirl effects. If you go back the other way, you clean that up. So that's how you get this smooth surface. Each time I'm filling this pattern, it's about 45 minutes. So if I'm doing that 4 times just for the final cut, let alone the 5 that came before.
Was there any concern that you would burn it too deep if you go?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Okay, okay, so the depth of the matrix has to be exactly 50 thousandths of an inch, right? And that's because the depth of the mold that you're using, you can see here, these are the cutting tools I'm using and the depths they have to go to. All right, so who knows the size of the height of a piece of type? Not Crispin.
0.918.
918. Okay, so every piece of type has to be exactly 0.918 of an inch. The mat has to be exactly 50 because the mold cavity is exactly. You love math, right? 918 minus 50. I don't. Anyway, if your mat depth is off, your piece of type is going to be too tall or too short. One of the things that Jim was notorious for, to me, not to most people, because I have cast and printed a lot of Jim's type, he wasn't very careful about this process. So for instance, a couple years ago, I printed a book of quotations from Marcus Aurelius, and I set it and printed it in Jim's type Hannibal, which he used for Tom Sawyer. any of you are familiar with Jim's edition of Tom Sawyer, it's an absolute masterpiece. He did everything. He designed the type, made the type, printed the book, bound the book. It's an absolute wonder that he did. He printed on a very heavy paper. And the reason he printed it on that heavy paper is that the type was not very level. So he could pound the hell out of it in that paper. And he made it work. It looks terrific. So when I used that type for Marcus Aurelius, what I discovered is that the lowercase e was short. The E, the most common letter. What I had to do to get decent results, because I wasn't pounding it into heavy paper, is put a tiny piece of Scotch tape on the bottom of every single E in the book. Now luckily it was a short book, but it was a lot of them. Because that piece of Scotch tape is 0.002, right? And that's how far off the map was, 0.02 of an inch. So if you don't cut the matrix the right depth, you're putting pieces of tape on the bottom of every lowercase e. Now, in reality, your question is really good because you do want to go too deep. Because if you don't go deep enough and it's finished, you can't do anything about it. You can't put it back in the machine. You never get it aligned right. So you want to go too deep. And earlier in this process, I showed you where I was rubbing the matrix blanket on the sandpaper. So what you do is you go a tiny bit too deep and you cast some type and you measure it. And if it's a little bit too tall, you rub the matrix on that sandpaper, you cast a few more, and you keep doing that until it's perfect. So you don't try to engrave to the perfect depth, it's impossible. You always go just a little bit too deep. So here it is. This is after the engraving, where it's gone, I've done it on purpose too deep, and then this machine right here is a depth gauge. Right now it's a standard, so that standard is exactly 50 thou, right? So I set this measuring tool so that that point on the gauge is exactly where I need it to be. And then I put that into the matrix that I engraved, and the goal is to have that at the exact same spot. And so if it's not, I take it and I rub it on some sandpaper, I use this tool again, and I keep gauging it until it's perfect. Those marks on that thing, I don't know if I believe this, but I've been told are 10 thou of an inch. That's how accurate this crazy little tool is. Okay. We're getting there. Now the casting part of this video is very quick. It basically just says, then I cast the type. That's a whole different process, and we won't get into that tonight. But here you can see are the finished matrices. There they are on the supercaster, Jim's supercaster. This is the matrix folder that I used to actually put the matrix into the machine. And I think there's a short video clip here of actually some typing. Yeah. So I'm just typing the matrix into the holder, and in a second I'm going to feed that into the machine. That matrix folder is made by a friend of mine named Dan Jones in Toronto. I met him at one of the conferences, and I didn't have a holder that could use these kinds of matrices. He actually made one for me. Alright, so that's going to be in the supercaster. That's going to start moving up and down on the mold of the machine. Just over here you can see the pot with molten metal in it. And that's being injected in up from underneath. It's filling the cavity of the mold. Right there, the second you can see a piece of type there. Just did. Another one. There. The beauty of the supercaster, Jim, there's only two of them in Canada. Jim had one and Dan Jones had one in Toronto. So Dan and I are the only two people that have these. There's a handful down in the States. The beauty of this machine is you can cast type from 6 point, super tiny, all the way up to 72 points. So most casting machines are a very limited range of what you can do. Supercasters were made in England. They were never sold in North America, but a few people snuck them over. There was actually a sales agreement that they would not be sold in North America. There's some finished type. That's essentially the end of it. Okay, so all of this effort went into Crispin's book. Did this all for Crispin. No, the truth is, the alphabet that I did, there were a variety of reasons for it. One, I loved it, but B, it was capsule. So I did 26 letters plus 3 punctuation, so 27 or 29 characters in total. To do lowercase and the full range of punctuation was way too daunting for me. Jim did it multiple times. But this is 16 years it's taken me to get that done. I know I've rambled quite a bit tonight, but what's gone into this, I don't know how to put this because I'm just so shocked that I actually managed to do it. And the reason I wanted to come and talk about it tonight when the Alcuin folks asked if I would, is because I finally feel like I can stand here and read this that I read at Jim's memorial and say I did it, right? And I often, when I've got people at my shop, I tell them I feel like Jim's standing over my shoulder when I'm working. And I have felt that for years, but it's a different feeling now. Now I feel like he's smiling, whereas for a decade I felt like he was going, but it's extremely rewarding, and what makes it all the more rewarding is the fact that the first book that I used this type on was a book that Crispin wrote. So it's a poem and an essay that Crispin wrote. I have a copy up here, you guys can come up and have a look at it in a minute. What I've got up here, although I made a bit of a mess of it, and I would love you guys to come up and have a look at this stuff, so please take it. Over here is a monotype die case. So this is what's used in a composition caster. So a composition caster actually casts the type in the sequence you want it. So if you want the sentence to say the cat walked down the road, what this does is it goes to the T position and then to the H and then to the E and then to the C and then to the A, and it casts those letters in that sequence. Most typecasters want these kinds of machines. I don't, because I actually like setting type by hand, so I don't want the machines to do it. So the other option is these, which are called monotype flat mats, which I mentioned earlier. And this is what you would use on a supercaster. So here you've got your capital O, you put it in the machine and you cast 200 O's. And then you put it in a different matrix and you cast 200 N's. And you put those all in the type case and you set your type by hand. I much prefer doing that. I much prefer doing that in the future. Next up, this is the one. Please feel free to pick this one up. I don't care if you drop it on the floor, it doesn't matter. You can see it's got a big X on it because this one didn't work out. It's also got a W on the other side that didn't work out. This is just an example of sort of what a matrix looks like when it's finished. This is just not very good. In the box here, I've got all the finished mats for Orfei, the face that I designed for Crispin's book. I would prefer we didn't handle these too much because you can imagine a lot of work went into it. There's also just some bar stock. And then what I have here are some keepsakes. So this is just a little keepsake showing the type. This was actually printed for Parenthesis, the magazine of the Five Press Book Association. And I had a whole bunch of extras. So I brought a bunch tonight, so anybody who would like one, please feel free to take one. They're just right here. And what's on the galley tray here is the actual type that was used to print these, in addition to the full alphabet of the Orfei type. So by all means, come up and have a look at these once I stop talking. And also on this table is a copy of Crispin's book. Here's the title page with that type that I sort of walked you through tonight making. Well, here's another book that came out. This is the book I produced last year. It really doesn't have anything to do with what I talked about tonight. And back in 2016, I did this book called Latin and Antelope. And this is, they used to call them a commonplace book. It's sort of a type specimen where I'm just sort of randomly picking different types from around my shop and finding interesting quotes. So each page of the book is a different typeface with a different quote, just to sort of show off some of the types in the shop. And this book was really well received. Now, the deluxe edition of this book, which is what I brought tonight to show, also came with photo essay of casting the type to print that book. So it's just more photographs from the casting room. So I brought that in tonight. These all sold out a long time ago, but I just brought this in if you were curious to have a look at some of the photos. And also, if anyone would like to buy one, this is the just previous issue of Parenthesis from the Five Press Book Association. And it has a fairly lengthy article that I wrote about what I just talked about tonight. In the cup. So this is essentially describing the same process that I talked about tonight, except here it's probably coherent. so now, just any questions? I know I've probably gone too long. No? Okay, we're all right.
Keep going.
This is the part I was looking forward to. I hope that there are things that I can answer. I know I brushed over a lot of things, and if we had been able to hear the video, it would have been great, but we had to wait. Yeah.
Your discussion about Jim almost put me in tears because for years and years and years I would have him come to my design classes to show his work, or I take students to his gingerbread house studio
Yeah.
in the West.
Yeah, we're at a
And
weird
that was
time now
wonderful.
because so many people don't know him now.
Exactly, but you missed one of his attributes. You talked about his design and logo design, type design, casting, all those things. He was a musician as well. And
Yeah.
remember, for making faces,
Yep.
he included the jazz music.
The other thing I wanted to show you
Explaining.
tonight is I had a clip from Making Faces that I wanted to show you, and he's playing the guitar. Yeah.
He did it all.
That's one of many things I missed.
You also didn't mention the illustrations that Tom Sawyer.
Right.
Right.
Well, it
The whole
was
thing.
lots of
Yeah.
books,
So, I mean, I think Jim, probably most of his career in terms of income came from his illustrations, more than
And
anything
logos.
else. So his printing and type design, these sorts of things are things he did in his basement, while he was working commercially as a graphic designer. But I think most of us in this room know him for what he did in typography. In fact, I didn't know anything about the commercial work. Yeah, I know, when I was rereading over what I read at the memorial, getting ready for tonight,
It was interesting, the last time I saw Jim, which is about 2 weeks before he died, Jan and I had a book we did in 2011, it was published, as far as I remember, of Shakespeare's play Pericles. And in setting the type for the book, I set the main text in mellifluous, which is an old style long typeface. But the titling and a lot of the text type in the book, which was meant to be, for some reason, expansive or loud or something, was a typeface that Jim designed called Dunsing Titling, which was.
That's actually what these patterns are for.
Well, there, yeah. I thought I recognized that. See, yeah, well, that sort of squared off the curve. Paul Hayden Dunsing was a man in the States who was also a private type founder like Jason and like Jim. And Jim and Paul were old friends. And for Paul's 50th birthday, Jim designed this typeface and gave it to him as a present. But he designed it in every size from 12 to 72. No, 12 to 60.
Yeah.
60 is the biggest one I have. And he, at some point, gave Jan and me, a large font of every size of his type. Jim was like this. You would go to his house and you never came away without something he'd given you, you know? And it was humbling to be with such a generous man. Anyway, I brought some of the pages that we printed using his type. And what I had done with it, I don't know if we get to this, I would brought some pages, but what I'd done with it is mixed the sizes so that the type was sort of moving around on the page. Because the play is a play, and we were, in the words of Simon Brett, the man with whom we provided the wood engravings, Simon said we were wanting to stage the play on the page, stage the play on the page. So I mentioned volume, in the scene when Pericles is screaming about the storm at sea for the winds to die down, I used his Dunsing type in large sizes because he's yelling, you know. And Simon integrated a wood engraving, or I integrated my type with his engraving, both, so that you could see the image of him yelling, and you could hear by seeing the type that he was yelling as well. Anyway, the thing I wanted to get to with all this palaver was that Jim, who had designed the face, it never occurred to him that people would use different sizes together. And I remember he got out, he put on his glasses, and he peered at this page, and then he got on a magnifying glass, and he looked at what I'd done, and he said, I want to see all of this, you know? And I said, well, I'll show you when it's done. But 2 weeks later, it was done, so. But anyway, it's lovely because his concentration and his sense of his own work, as I've so often found in the case of people who have real genius, they don't really understand completely what they've done because they concentrate so much on every single aspect of it. You know? And if they didn't, they wouldn't have the work. Sorry, I shouldn't have talked so long.
I was trying to find the
Oh, there
spread.
it is. That's the page we're talking about.
And in here is the type. Dunsing, yes. It's called Dunsing for Paul Hayden Dunsing, who was sort of Jim's mentor. He was another private typecaster, type designer and caster in the States. Crazy name of the place he was from?
Kalamazoo, Michigan. And he sold dental equipment.
Right.
So little drills, he was, that's probably how he got started, I think.
So Jim would talk about Dunsing the way that I'm sort of talking about Jim, and with awe at what he had accomplished. Dunsing really encouraged Jim, who was hacking away in his basement in New Westminster.
Speaking of different size types, once you have your main cut, your with laser, could you
We're getting into
pantograph
it.
at different reductions to carve different size type, or
Yep.
do you have to carve a new main because the characteristics of something at 10 point are different than something at
So
48?
you're getting into a contentious area here, because Gaudi and ATF, well, no, Gaudi anyway, would tell you you could use one pattern for every type. And if you look at digital type, in the early days of digital type, they were all run off one master pattern. These days, if you want a decent typeface, you're gonna get something that comes in a variety of ways. One of the things I have to pound into my students' heads is when you're designing something, if the type gets bigger, it needs to get thinner. They have a wrong intuition that as you get bigger, it should get bolder. The problem is, on a page like what Crispin's done here, that bigger type would completely dominate the page, and it's all your eye would see. What you want is as the size gets bigger, the size is providing emphasis. But you want the color of the page, the overall color of the page, to stay consistent. And so as you get bigger, you want the letter to get thinner. If you're going to approach type design that way, no, you can't use the same pattern. You would need to create patterns for each size of type that you're going to do. Now, the Benton engraver that I mentioned earlier had adjustments in it, and I've never understood the math here. But as you adjust it for scale, you can also adjust for weight. So as you engrave the bigger stuff, it would do it narrower. But even that is allowing, to some extent, an algorithm to do the work for you, because that's all well and good for the main stroke getting thinner. But now your serifs are getting so thin you can hardly see them anymore, right? So you want some areas getting thinner, but not all of them. And you can only do that if you're custom drawing a pattern for every size. So, it's a complex issue. And a lot of people would say it's too much work, just use the pattern, adjust the ratio on the pantograph and cut it. And to a large extent, that's what Jim did, but Jim knew his pantograph well enough that he could make those micro adjustments so that they didn't become too heavy in the larger size. Yeah, it's a tricky one, and that's one of the things about the difference between the fonts that come on your computer and a well-made one, is that it accounts for that. So, if you know that it exists, but yeah, it's a tricky issue. I only cut this in one size, so that wasn't an issue for me. But I would like to cut it in other sizes, and it'll be curious to see if I go the distance that we can do that.
You were talking about how your cutting tool, you had to make several of them exactly the same because it would wear out as you were going.
More that they break.
They would break.
Because they're hard enough that the brass won't wear them down for the amount that I'm using them, but they will break.
So as you were tracing the acrylic pattern, would you hear it when it broke?
No, that's the
How
fun
would
part.
you know?
What happens is there's a tiny bit of resistance on the machine, because that engraving tool is actually working its way through the metal, right? So I would be tracing it, and all of a sudden it would slip, and I would know, okay, something just happened. Sometimes there was no indication, so I would do the entire thing, and what's happening on this end is that there's oil in the matrix, right, to lubricate the engraving. So I can't see at all what's happening. So after I think I've done it, before I take the matrix out of the machine, I take compressed air and I blow out everything that's in there, and I get in with a loupe and look at it. And sometimes what happens is I realize only half the letter engraved, and that means it broke halfway through the process, but I didn't know that. So I spent 45 minutes tracing nothing.
Did you have to start over?
Well, the problem there is that when I put in another cutting tool, I'm never gonna get it to the exact same depth, so I have to so I would have to do that cut over, not the whole matrix, but that cut. And there have been times where I went, I I actually did it, I cast some type, and I wasn't happy with the type, and I tried to put the matrix back in, and there was one time where I think by fluke, I got it in the exact same position as it but that's not common. Are you gonna sneak up here?
Well, I think what I'd like to do is bring the formal part
Yeah.
to an end and then invite people up. But
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
quick word on behalf of tonight's sponsor, the Alcuin Society. Everything I was gonna say is here, so please read it yourself. But what I would like to flag is that tonight's talk by Jason is the most recent in 60 years of talks and events and publishing by the Alcuin Society. And we're very proud of our 60 years, and we're very proud that Jason does a wonderful presentation. So thank you very much.
Please feel free to have a look, and I'm happy to answer more questions. I just really want to get some more online. You got a quick one?
Should just mention, I think Jim's archive.
Yes.
SF.
Oh, one more thing before I go, on that note.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I was clearing out Jim's shop, another of the frustrating things about Jim, SFU came in and took most of the patterns to put in with his archive at SFU, which is where they should be. Luckily, they forgot a few things in there now. One day they will get to SFU, but for the time being, I'm enjoying it. Thank you, Gina. Okay, so I brought home a bunch of cases of type. So the type that Jim had cast that he used, and I thought, this is awesome. I've got some type that Jim cast and I'm gonna be able to print with it. And then I got home and almost every single one of those cases, there is no sorts of at least one letter. Because what would happen is he would decide, I'm not happy with that one, I'm gonna recut that. So he'd scoop them all out of the case, chuck them in the pot, and then he never got around to recut them. So I've got all these cases of type that are completely useless unless I cut a new matrix. So it's, you know, it's good motivation for me to fill in some of the gaps. Okay, so yeah, please come up and have a look.